Thanks for joining me today. I'm going to jump into some questions given our time constraints or the time constraints I've created for us.
Absolutely. I'm excited. I also have my little copy of Parasocialite here for reference.
Me too. Well, it's all blurry, but
So,
behind me is just a boring wall
oh, I see.
shoved into a corner. And I think well, I don't know, it's mildly embarrassing, but here we go. So, Brittany, I feel like I'm inclined to call you Brittany.
That works for me.
All right. You are the co-founder of Car Crash Collective, a poetry and prose reading series, and you're the author of a relatively new collection called Parasocialite, which, best as I can tell, is a mixture of autofiction and poetry that deals with the dreams, fears, and disillusionment of young adulthood in whatever contemporary age we're calling this. The collection starts off with a story about what might have been your first kiss, which you write had been intended for the DJ Deadmau5. And it ends with a poem titled Hello Kitty Sweet, which is more or less about a social media induced apathy, the subtle violence of surgically embodying someone else's dead flesh, and the fantasy of fleeting casual sex. Everything in between feels like a dreamlike puzzle in which the reader might be compelled to put together a kind of coming of age story. In any case, the writing is propulsive, addicting, and opens up the equally dumb and exciting question in my head, what will she do next? But before we get too far into the nature of your book, I do want to touch on why you're on this conversation series, which is to say, what I find interesting about you, given the fact that I wasn't really familiar with your writing when you first slid into my DMs. So your work thematically has a lot to do with fantasies of fame and of a kind of longing for recognition by traditional arts and literature institutions. Obviously, that's not a unique perspective. I think most artists, writers, etc., myself included, would love to be lauded for our work. But I think the ability to create alternative spaces, to throw events or publish anthologies where you allow community to grow around you is a rare and valuable skill and something you seem to be excelling at.
Thank you.
I kind of love that you just asked me if you could be on this conversation series. And then when I did my sort of lazy social media research, it was immediately obvious that you were already involved in all of this literary shit. You seem to have a very reciprocal relationship to the scene that you participate in. So I want to ask a bit about what you're doing. Tell me about Car Crash Collective, this new anthology you're putting out, and whatever else you're up to outside of writing your own books.
Absolutely. So I always like to have a few different projects going. I feel like that's most fun. And then also, as you can tell from Parasocialite, I enjoy sometimes working on really funny things and other things that are really dark. So I feel like it's nice to be able to sort of toggle between those two options. And I'm glad you mentioned that how I ended up here is sliding into your DMs because I'm a big proponent of sliding into people's DMs in general. And that's actually how I met Aaron, who I host Car Crash with.
Okay.
Where when I had moved to LA, I like didn't really have too many friends. I grew up on the East Coast, and I specifically was looking for more friends who were into writing, and we had been featured in one of the same publications. So I just sent her a message asking if she'd want to go out to dinner, and then Car Crash was born. So we're working on a Car Crash anthology right now. Primarily, we are a reading series, and that is sort of people have asked us, like, is the reading series sort of like a way of like gaining leverage to start your own magazine or whatever? And that's not how we think of it at all. We're not really so interested in that. We more so both just wanted to have a space to curate a community, allow people the opportunity to mingle with other writers in the scene, and allow ourselves that opportunity as well, and also give us a way to connect with other artists we admire in those spaces. So really building like in-person events is what we're most interested in. But we did think it would be cool to do some kind of project to, I guess, like cement the ethos of Car Crash in like a tangible object. And Meta Label reached out to us and asked if we wanted to collab. And a lot of people like have asked us if there's some way like, or if we have a publication they can submit to, or if they can get involved when they like don't live in New York or LA. which are the states where we host most of our events. So it sort of fell together naturally. And we just wrapped up submissions for those. We're like going through all of them and making our final decisions right now. But it's been really fun. Aaron and I also just like recently edited a series of like poetry and prose submissions for Dream Boy Book Club, which also is the publisher of Parasocialite. So this is sort of like our second foray into the editorial side of things, and we really enjoy it. Um, Ultimately, though, I would say I am like most interested in writing and like producing my own work. Like that's where my heart lies. Right now, I'm sort of like in film land. I have a few feature projects that are sort of in the pre-production stages. One of them is an incel horror feature. So if,
We'll get to that
oh my gosh,
because I
amazing.
know you said you want to talk a lot about this, and I need to stop you so we don't spend the entirety of this conversation
Yes.
about that. But great.
I will not go on about incels for too long. I also did want to sort of push back on the assertion that parasocialite is autofiction.
Oh, it's not. I mean, I don't know. So tell me what it is.
I mean, a lot of the characters, like anybody who knows me, like I have a lot of friends who grew up with me, read the book and tell me that they could just like notice like things that I had done and like traits and like circumstances of my life popping up in like every single story, which is like so the case. Like I went to Catholic school in the suburbs. A lot of the characters are like similar to me in terms of like personality traits, circumstances in life. I was definitely like a late bloomer, and I feel like that's sort of a theme that runs throughout a lot of the stories. And obviously, I moved to California, and I would say the poems are pretty auto-fictional. Like a lot of the poems were written about like distinct experiences that happened to me. I do indeed have like dead person gums in my mouth. I like had to get gum surgery, and I guess like I got like a kind of transplant, which is a whole other story to tell. But yeah, most of the stories are like sort of cherry picking like traits or circumstances from my life. And then I sort of build a fictional story around that. Or a lot of them are honestly kind of borrowed from like things that happened to people around me when I was growing up. And I sort of built a story, like imagining an alternate reality almost of like, what if I had been in that situation?
So would you just label this as literary fiction and poetry and just totally get out of this
I
auto fiction bullshit?
I mean, I guess like that's how I tend to describe it, but I think that's sort of like, I think this is what Danielle said when she was on the podcast too. Like, sort of playing with the autofiction label can be fun because it creates intrigue. And I'm all for intrigue. So, I mean, a lot of me is definitely in the book, but there's like no one story where you can point to it and I can be like, all of those things happened to me.
Well, that's disappointing. But not really. It's funny. It's because of the surge of popularity of autofiction in probably the past decade. I feel like when I read first person perspective writing, especially from younger people, I kind
Mhm.
of just like fall into this assumption that it's mostly about them. And then I have to kind of like step back and be like, well, I write shit in that vein, and a lot of it is totally made up, but a lot of it's not. So let me get into a question about your book. I mean, these are kind of meandering long statements, which then we'll talk about it, or you will talk about it. So let's get back to your book, Parasocialite. I think it's safe to say it's of the zeitgeist in the sense that these poems and short stories are so often embedded in digital culture with references to social media, the implied narcissism that we all embody as a result, the allure and fear of being watched, the greater fear of not being watched, etc. There's also this idea of you having moved to Los Angeles to pursue a career in the film industry and that you've already been jaded by that world. But we're mostly fed this notion through short poems that leave out the details we might have discovered in a novel or memoir. For example, your poem Hollywood Baby reads, I've made it among the people who don't need to make it, who don't have school tomorrow. Better men want to exploit me now. I used to have dreams about murder. Now I write scripts about it. I park my dying car beneath security strobe lights. The animation lags. I love that poem, by the way.
Yeah.
So I'm curious about the structure of this book, this collection. There does seem to be an almost chronological or thematic narrative that could be simplified or reduced into innocence, i.e., the first kiss mentioned at the beginning of your book, leading toward the love, lust, disgust, and violence that makes up a lot of the latter part of your book. Was that a conscious decision? Did your writing naturally evolve that way? Or better yet, tell me how you view this collection and what meaning might have been embedded in the way it's laid out.
Totally. So I would say that Parasocialite was written like the earliest story or poem is from like my first year of college, which would have been like 2017, up until like early 2023 was when or actually, no, early 2024 was when I like finished the last story in the collection. So most of them, yeah, I would say they're from like the last 5 years or so. And around 2 or 3 years ago, I sort of had a moment when I realized, oh, a lot of these are circling around parasocial relationships. Every time I write a story or poem that sort of even obliquely deals with these themes, I'm going to like write it down and link to it in this Google Doc so I can like sort of build this up if I want to make a project out of it someday. And then I decided I wanted to like actively and consciously do that when I saw that Dream Boy Book Club had a call for submissions because I really wanted to work with Jonathan in like a publishing capacity. I'd hosted some events with him before, and he'd also published shorter works of mine. So I sort of like kicked it into gear. And what I decided to do was the stories aren't like totally organized by when they were written. I would say there like are some trends in that regard because the first section is very much it's called God in Suburbia. It's very much written about like the suburbs based on my experiences growing up in suburban Maryland, like just outside DC, going to Catholic school, etc. And again, like yeah, there I think the most recent story in the collection is animal abuse, which does go in that section. So again, like not entirely chronological,
Okay.
but definitely some earlier works in that section. And then we go to uh God in is it the real world? Is that what I call it?
So on
God in the real world, yes.
page 45. Okay.
And that's sort of like a double entendre because a lot of those stories about are about like being on the internet. So there's this idea that like the internet is just as real as anything else when that's how you're communicating with people. And I think subconsciously this sort of does tie into like COVID era patterns of communication. For example, the story of the CW is about an interaction I had with an actor on Bumble during like, I think it was like maybe early COVID or just before COVID, but definitely, yeah, a lot of like stories drawn from those like hyper online experiences. And also there's the idea of like moving out of your like suburban town, going somewhere bigger. So a lot of these were sort of written about or like reflecting upon my time when I was going to school at Yale, living in New Haven, which is like a smaller city, but like farther from home than I'd ever been. I was more independent than I'd ever been. And I was also spending a lot of time taking the train to New York. And that's when I had a lot of my like big city real world experiences. And then the last section is, of course, God in the Movies about moving to California. And if you look at each of these sections through the lens of parasocial relationships, in the first section, I'm kind of investigating how like obsession functions on like a very small scale level. For example, like a meeting, like thinking about like a popular person in your school and wondering what their inner life is like, something like that. And then in the second section, it's more so like people you meet online and realize that you don't really know. And then the last section, it's like, wow, I'm in Hollywood now. I'm going to parties where I'm like actually running into people I'm familiar with ahead of time. Like, how do I navigate this?
But given what you just said, I think we could throw a little bit of salt of autofiction in here. I wasn't that far off, but I get what you mean. Okay,
Yeah.
so back up a second. Both for me and the audience, what is the definition of a parasocial relationship?
So I guess you could describe it as a one-sided relationship or a relationship where one person like knows a lot more about the other person or cares a lot more about the other person
I see.
than that person does. Like it's not reciprocal. It's not two people who are like equally besties. So it could be like the relationship you have with a celebrity where you feel like you know them, but you don't actually, or the relationship you have with somebody you follow on Instagram, and maybe even if they do follow you back, you're building your impression of them based on like their social media posts, not from any like real or meaningful interactions.
Got it. Thank
It's a
you.
relationship that's like kind of built on fantasy.
So what is this integration of God into the sections of your book? What's this about?
Well, as I mentioned, I grew up going to Catholic school and I'm still a very spiritual person. I feel like that kind of comes up just like that's touched on in some of the stories, but I feel like more so like subconsciously, there's this acknowledgement that all of the characters are like searching for some higher purpose or some deeper meaning in life, even when they're navigating these very like emotionally shallow situations or interactions, like going to parties in Hollywood or like swiping past profiles on a dating app. All of them, even if they're like not really admitting it to themselves or don't fully realize, are like looking for something more in a greater sense. And a lot of that like comes through just like deeper, more meaningful human connections that they are striving for with these, like within these parasocial relationships.
Got it. That's interesting. I love that.
Thank you.
So you've touched on this a little bit in our conversation here, but you did study some aspect of filmmaking at Yale, correct?
Yes, I studied screenwriting.
Okay, and now you're out here in Los Angeles, obviously involved in writing literature and doing these reading series, but it sounds like you've also been involved in the film industry. I know you won a prize pretty early on in your life to come out here and produce a film based on a screenplay that you wrote, correct?
I did. So I won this competition called AT&T Hello Lab when I was 20 years old. And the premise of the competition was basically like write a screenplay. And I think it had to be like pretty like 15 pages or something like that. And if they liked it, they would pair you with a director and give you $100,000 budget to actually like make that film. And then they would help you with like festivals and distribution. And they had five different winners. I was one of them. And it was just like an absolutely insane experience. Like, I grew up in Maryland. I don't like have any connections to the film world at all. It was always just sort of like a dream that I didn't know how to access. So, like, getting that like call that's like you're going to Hollywood was very insane. And the program was just like such a helpful crash course into how film works. Like, what is it like to sort of like have those pre-production meetings for a film? What do you need to consider when you're getting a project off the ground? And like more importantly than anything, I realized that I just like loved being on a set so much. I was like, I want to do this for the rest of my life. And I have like such a deep love for film and filmmaking that like will always be adjacent to my love for like literature. I think they very much go hand in hand, like in that I'm like primarily just like interested in storytelling and I'll get these ideas and like every time I have one, I have to like really do some soul searching and think like, so is this like a short story? Is this a book? Is this a screenplay? But I did like I studied screenwriting and then I also did the creative writing program. So I just like exhausted my schedule I like overloaded it with any writing course I could get my hands on. And the scheduling department, I feel like was always kind of annoyed with me because of that,
Uh,
but it was like writing city.
Um, I learned recently how old you are, given because we met a couple times this past weekend. I'm sort of blown away because it's my impression. I mean, for a lot of reasons. First of all, like both you and Danielle are kind of the youngest people I've talked to on this series, and I think you're both quite good. I'm a fan of both of your work, but I'm sort of like, what the fuck? How are people in their early to mid 20s writing anything worth reading? But second of all, when you talk about your love for movies, I was sort of under the impression that like Gen Z or is that the generation you identify with?
I mean, that's like what I guess I technically belong to. I don't like have any emotional, if anything,
Okay.
like a negative emotional connotation. I guess I typically call myself like a zillennial because I'm like, I don't want people to think I'm born after the year 2000. I was born in 1999, but I mean,
Well,
more or less, I'm Gen Z.
But it seems like most people I meet of your generation don't give a fuck about movies. Or if they do, it's kind of like the Marvel universe. Well, maybe that's changing even. This is already, I feel like that's kind of falling off a cliff as we speak. But is this something that you were like interested in as a kid?
I
Like more
mean,
like cinema as a thing?
so first of all, I'll say that like I've been really fortunate to always be surrounded by like people my age who are really interested into movies. Like
Really? Okay.
whenever I'm home for like the holidays, my elementary school and middle school best friends and I will like get together and go to the movies or like go to someone's house and have a movie night. And of course, like being in New York or LA, everyone is kind of like way more interested in movies than the rest of the population.
Sure.
So like so many of my hangouts were just like movie nights. But okay, so growing up, my parents were like pretty strict. I was like the firstborn child, and they're just like, my mom especially, just like very protective of me. And I wasn't allowed to watch any PG-13 movies until I was 13, and I wasn't allowed to watch any rated R movies until I was 17. And I didn't. Like I like didn't even try. I was
Yeah.
just like, recording. And like, well, but once I got to age 17, however, I think like by that point, I was kind of like, okay, well, like all bets are off. Like it's go time. I'm going to watch like everything. So once I like got to that point, I was like, I just wanted to see everything I could get my hands on. And I think like ironically, my mom being strict, like gave me an interest in like more like avant-garde or like horror or like transgressive filmmaking. And I especially became interested in like using horror tropes as sort of like in an allegorical fashion, which I mean is like most horror, more horror than like is discussed in the popular consciousness. But yeah, I'm like very interested in that tradition. And yeah, so I like, it's so funny. I'm always like thanking my mom for making me the writer I am today, where it's like every like movie I'm writing is always like definitely like rated R. And I'm like, sorry, my little sister like cannot watch this for a few years.
Well, let's talk about this movie that you want to make. All
Mhm.
right, I'm going to read the question I put out here. So you and I have met a couple of times now in real life. You've mentioned at least once that you're working on a screenplay about incels, otherwise known as
At least once.
involuntarily celibate men. So prior to knowing this about you, I did pick up on a consistent theme that permeates your book. Seems like a simultaneous desire for the attention of men and a fear of their potential violence. Maybe you can talk about this a little bit because your book touches on the Columbine shooters, a brief friendship with a young man who may be a sociopath, men stalking you or some character you've come up with at art galleries, etc. And now you're writing a film about incel culture, which is known for its explicitly negative and violent attitudes towards women. Where does this interest come from? Or do all women in 2024 feel this simultaneous attraction to and fear of men? Well, I guess hetero-leaning women. We'll leave it there.
Okay, so I have so much to say about this, as like I'm sure you can tell. It's interesting because I think when we were like first talking about parasocialite, you said that you picked up on like the fear of men as like a sort of a constant theme. And I interpreted that as like the fear of men, as in like the fears that men have, which
Oh, well, no. I mean, there's this story, but it's not explicitly it's like a two-pronged thing because I first read like kind of figured this out and there's a few stories that touch on this, but there's the one about this character who I just assumed was based on you, who kind of has an ongoing relationship with this young man at a cafeteria in a mall, and
yeah.
she's like intrigued by the fact that he has like no emotional response to violence and keeps consuming more and more explicit imagery, which is like probably typical of a lot of men of my generation. I mean, I remember being very intrigued by like finding snuff films and kind of like war documentary footage of people being murdered and so forth. I think I kind of grew out of this, but in any case, let's get this back to what your fascination is with this.
So I would say honestly, like there is a lot of it like about the like yeah, like the fears that men have. So it does kind of like go both ways where I'm interested in both perspectives.
Okay.
Okay, so I would say, okay, so I'm going to give you like the TLDR version of this because I could like make the story really long. But I think like my interest in school shootings stems from the fact that Sandy Hook is like the first event that I remember having like a really emotional, strong like response to growing up. Like I remember when that happened, like my friends and I, because like we were this was like, I mean, I don't remember what year it was, unfortunately, but my friends and I were in middle school
Okay.
and we weren't texting about this. We were all like emailing back and forth. Like we had like one long email thread that was called like Sandy Hook or something like that. And we were all just like going back and forth about like news reports that we had heard or like rumors. And there was a lot of like initial misreporting and like theorizing about the Sandy Hook shooting at first, where people like, I think initially Adam Lanza's brother was reported as the shooter, and then it was like, oh, were the brothers in on it together? Like, was their mom in on it? There was just like a lot of hearsay going around. And I like specifically remember like reflecting on that at the time and like thinking a lot about like the ways in which we like talk about these events and try to process them collectively. And so like ever since then, I was like, and I've always like known that I've wanted to be a writer. So anytime something like affects me emotionally, I'm like, how do I like, use this experience to like say something or like, yeah, later. And I was like, okay, so I'm going to write something about a school shooting one day. And at the same time, I also like really, really love the Shakespeare play Macbeth. And I like wanted to do a creative adaptation of it. And I was like, I am going to do an adaptation of Macbeth someday. And then not until when I was in college did I get the idea to combine the two. And I was like, I am going to like, this is what I'm going to do. Because I think at that point, like, when I was in high school, that was also kind of when like the whole like obsession with the Columbine boys on Tumblr thing came about. And I would sort of like stumble upon that content. And there was like a Vice documentary about it
Oh,
where,
I'm totally unfamiliar. There was a period of time in your high school era where
yes.
people your age on Tumblr were obsessed with the Columbine shooters. Okay. Well, this is outside of my reference point. Okay.
Yeah, so I guess like that's how I really found out that like Columbine had happened and like learned about the shooters. And yeah, there was like a Vice documentary on it, and I was like really into Vice documentaries at the time. And then, so yeah, I got to high school. I was like, I'm going to combine these. I'm going to do Macbeth, where Macbeth is like leading up to a school shooting. And I'm going to like use this to like raise awareness about how these things happen, etc. I like felt really strongly about it. And then so like a bunch of people auditioned. We had like a full cast and crew. And then the Parkland shooting happened. And all of a sudden, like the discourse totally changed where before people were kind of like, let's talk about these events and like unpack them. The Columbine, or not Columbine, the like some of the survivors of the Parkland shooting, like we were really pushing forward this narrative, like, let's not talk about the shooter, let's only talk about the victims. And so there was like a sudden backlash to my show on campus where a lot of people dropped out of the production and told me that they were uncomfortable doing a show about like school violence at the time. Specifically, a lot of them mentioned like because like the school shooter character was the protagonist and that the play was named after him. It was called Macbeth, by the way, because that was like the thing that he was called at school. And I like they wanted to call me in for like a meeting with like the theater advisory board, and they were like, can you at least like change the name? And I was like, it's named after him because this is literally just Macbeth, you guys. Like it's just Macbeth. It's almost a line for line modernization. I like didn't do anything too crazy to it. And it was just like really controversial. And I ended up having to postpone it by a semester. But that like really made me, before I had been sort of like interested in it more from like an activism, let's talk about gun violence sort of sense. And then I was like, whoa, why do people get so like emotionally intense when we have these conversations? Why are people like afraid of like discussing certain things? And like, why do we think it's like, yeah, like why do we think that discussing some of these perspectives is like wrong or like dangerous? And like, how do we all come to some consensus that will like move forward understanding of like why people commit school shootings and also like how do we stop them? And then like when I feel like incels were kind of a hot topic, I would like read a lot of articles about them in like publications like The Cut when I was in like late high school and early college years. And similarly, I felt like the articles were always sort of pointing out like there were these guys named incels and they're on these forums and they like say these like horrible misogynistic things. And I was like, I feel like we're not doing enough research into like specifically, I was for the incels, I was like really hooked on the language. Like, why do they use this specific kind of language? Like, and yeah, like what are their motivations and also like what are sort of the in-group dynamics of incels? How do those like contribute to the problem? I felt like there was sort of a lot of uncharted territory. And so I decided to make my senior thesis project about school shooters and incels. And for the incel portion, I went on Omegle where you can like chat with random strangers on the internet. And I typed in incel for the category. And I just like randomly chatted with like dozens and dozens of incels and
The
recorded them.
people, you were telling me this, and just to clarify, these men were categorizing themselves as incels
They were categorizing
on
themselves.
Omegle, which I've never used
Yes.
in my life. Okay.
They were categorizing themselves as incels, but interestingly, like once I like identified myself, because this is all like text-based chatting as a woman, a lot of them would backtrack on like the notion that they were incels and they were like, well, I'm not an actual incel. I just typed this in because I'm like, I relate to the incel cause, but like I don't actually consider myself one.
What is
And
the incel cause?
like, I mean, just feeling lonely and trying to find a romantic partner. Obviously, that's like not the bulk of what it means to be an incel because there's also, again, those weird in-group dynamics and a lot of like rampant misogyny. But that is why I think the incels would like identify as their cause. So in my conversations, and honestly, a lot of this is just, I'll try to like be brief because I realize that the timer is running out.
Right.
I don't know. I mean I've like studied a little bit of psychology in school. Like I always try to like take courses when I can. And my mom's a psychologist. She like worked with like troubled teenage boys at one time and then later like mentally ill adults. And I think I've just like always felt very strongly in like trying to understand why these things happen. And like, I don't believe in like a punitive or carceral outlook. I really am coming at it from like a let's have conversations so we can sort of like change like these trajectories. Like, I don't think anybody comes out of the womb saying, like, hey, I want to shoot up a school or like,
Sure.
hey, I'm going to be an incel. And I feel like there still is this like very dark ages mentality of like, some people are just bad and we should like leave them alone, or it's like we're going to exhaust ourselves trying to like care about these people, which I think is like very ironic oftentimes given sort of like the communities where that rhetoric stems from. So I just like very strongly believe in trying to unpack these situations from all angles.
What did you learn from communicating with these men?
Well, a lot of them like really were open to different perspectives. They just didn't like the feeling of being lectured at. And once I came at them with an alternate perspective in like a non-confrontational way, they were like really open to discussion and hearing like alternate points of view and like almost were excited to be told alternate points of view in like a way that was like rational and understanding. And I don't think that's like any testament to like me being so special, but just the fact that like a lot of these people like never have the chance to engage with like outsiders in the community who are genuinely like invested in having these long conversations with them. And a lot of the conversations did take like hours and hours, but a lot of them like started the conversations like hurling slurs at me and being like, you disgusting woman. And then by the end of the conversation would be like, hey, like, I'm really glad we had this talk. Like, I wish I'd done things differently over the past few years, and now I'm going to try to like make some changes. Like I wish I had had this like change in perspective earlier. And I think a lot of them sort of are like stuck in this like sunk cost fallacy way of thinking where they're like, oh, this philosophy has to be true because I've devoted so much of my time to it. And I don't want this like to all be for nothing. But yeah, like I was surprised by how many of them sort of like were looking for a way out, but felt like they couldn't find one, and also had sort of like been brainwashed by this echo chamber into thinking like specifically the other incels were the only community that they would like be able to find platonically that would support them. And that was like talking to other incels was sort of their only option for like non-judgmental mental health care. And a lot of them, like for a lot of them, being a member of the incel community was just as much about like feeling like they had the support of these other men who they could identify with, like more so than anything else.
So I know we only have like 4 minutes left, but there seems to be kind of like two things happening here. I mean, your initial interest, at least my read of it, is a little bit like the salaciousness of the subject matter, right? There's like there's violence, there's this culture of men who sort of have this misogynistic worldview and seem to have a very at least internalized violence or violent perspective toward the world. But then you kind of bring in this mental health perspective. I'm wondering, is this film or like even the essay you wrote in high school, is there like a thesis to this, or is this more just kind of exploring this as a concept, or I don't know. In the time we have left.
Yeah, I mean, I would say I try not to like look at it from a salacious angle. Obviously there's always going to be like a little bit of that whenever we're talking about these subjects, like
Sure.
the open as members or like as people who are sort of like in the out group. But I am very interested in like the way that just like we as a society can't help but be like fascinated by these situations. And that's sort of what animal abuse is about, where like where she like has this altruistic interest in this like sociopathic teenager, but
Right.
also she's like limited in her ability to help him by the fact that she's just like, wow, it's so crazy getting to know a sociopath. And I think a lot of that stems from like the way I feel dissatisfied by a lot of like true crime media, where it feels sort of like, let's look at these people to reassure ourselves that like we are not like them, as opposed to like trying to glean anything from it. So I would say, I mean, like with my film, I want to just sort of like further the discussion as to why do people sort of like fall into these toxic echo chambers that are like very much anchored in these like powerful ideologies that like a lot of like even very like young people fall into. Like I was surprised by how many incels were teenagers as well. And then I also want to explore, I mean, like the incel movie is about a plastic surgeon who starts like operating on incels underground, but there's also a plot line about his wife and how she sort of like navigates like moving through the world, like and people's perceptions of her appearance and like how she's objectified. So I also just sort of want people to think more about like the politics of beauty and desire in general, which I think is kind of a like running theme throughout the book.
Absolutely. Well, we only have a minute left before this cuts us off. So thank you for sharing all that. I hope this gets
Absolutely.
produced. It's probably going to take several years at least to get to the point where I can watch it, but fingers crossed. Anyway, anyone watching this, I think this is a fascinating book, and if this could focus on it, it's called Parasocialite. I know this is blurred out. Anyway, it'll be listed in whatever the description. Anyway, thank you so much, Brittany, for chatting with me today. I'll have this up as soon as possible. Any final
Yeah.
words before you get cut off?
Final words. I guess if you're a director, hit me up. We're looking for directors right now for the Incel movie, and also, I don't know, just to keep having difficult conversations wherever you can.
Good. Great. Well, I think we're just going to get cut off here. So thanks so much for chatting with me. This has been a pleasure.
Absolutely. This has been great.